Michael Foster was a black surgeon working in a small town where his reputation mattered not only to his patients but to himself. He knew that he had to be twice as strong, faster, and smarter than anyone else to prove his worth. This path had been thorny and painful, but it had brought him success in his profession. He couldn't afford to be weak, despite his personal tragedy that always lingered like a shadow. His life's tragedy happened long ago when his younger brother, Ricky, was killed by police officers due to excessive violence on the road. It all happened too fast, and Michael, still a teenager, couldn't understand how to act. He remembered every detail of that day, the officers' indifference, their confidence in their own rightness, and their complete lack of remorse. Ricky was just a boy who forgot to take his documents. But the police gave him no chance to explain. He was black, and that was enough for his life to end in one moment. Michael couldn't forget how his mother had shaken with tears, trying to cope with the loss. He saw her lose all hope for justice. That moment was pivotal. Michael realized that if he didn't change something in this system, the story would repeat itself over and over. He swore to himself that he would become a doctor and fight for the truth, for those who, like Ricky, couldn't defend themselves. When the hospital call interrupted the silence, Michael knew this wasn't just another call. The nurse on the other end sounded tense. "Dr. Foster, we have an emergency," she said, her voice shaking with anxiety. A young woman in critical condition, she was brought in from an accident. "Please come as soon as you can." Michael immediately felt his blood boil with fear. He grabbed his keys and rushed out of the apartment. The drive to the hospital was familiar, but this time every meter seemed long and difficult. He thought about how every decision he made could be decisive, how tonight, like much of his life, would not be like any other. As Michael drove down the empty streets, his thoughts returned to Ricky. Every decision he made was a reflection of that tragedy. And here he was again, driving to save someone's life. It was his job, his duty. But what if this girl came from the same family, from the same circle of people he had encountered too many times before? What if her life was just as insignificant as his brother's in the eyes of the system? When his car approached the exit, suddenly the sirens appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but soon realized they were pulling him over. He hit the brakes hard and cursed his bad luck. Déjà vu, he thought. The same forces that stop him from moving forward. The officer approached his car, and Michael noticed him examining him closely before shining a flashlight directly in his eyes. His heart skipped a few beats, and he tensed, expecting the usual questions. "Speeding, doctor," the officer said, pointing to his documents. "Please present them." "I'm on my way to the hospital, we have an emergency," Michael replied quickly, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. He knew that explaining his situation wouldn't matter. They wouldn't believe him. At that moment, Michael felt that to them, he was just another black man who had to justify himself. "Documents," the officer repeated, ignoring his words. Michael realized that he needed to act fast. If he was delayed even by a minute, the life of that girl would be at risk. He quickly handed over his papers, feeling his anger rise inside. "Please," he said, barely holding back his emotions. "If it were your daughter, you'd want me to get there as quickly as possible." The officer scrutinized the documents as if he were checking their authenticity, then returned them with an indifferent look. "I repeat, no more speeding," he said, walking away from the car. Michael quickly started the car and sped off, ignoring the sirens fading behind him. He knew he was once again in the middle of this game, a game where his skin color and status as a doctor didn't matter. The only thought in his mind was, how much time did I lose? The girl at the hospital. She couldn't wait. He was black, and he knew his path would be much harder than anyone else's. He had long since learned that he had to work twice as hard to be valued. Michael Foster was a black surgeon in a small town, where his reputation was vital not only for his patients but for his own peace of mind. He knew he had to be twice as strong, faster, and smarter than anyone else to prove his worth. This path had been difficult and painful, but it had led him to success in his profession. He couldn't afford to be weak, despite the personal tragedy that always loomed over him, like a shadow. His life's tragedy happened long ago, when his younger brother, Ricky, was killed by police officers due to excessive violence on the road. It all happened too fast, and Michael, still a teenager, couldn't understand how to react. He remembered every detail of that day, the officers' indifference, their confidence in their own rightness, and their complete lack of remorse. Ricky was just a boy who forgot his documents. But the police gave him no chance to explain. He was black, and that was enough for his life to end in one moment. Michael couldn't forget how his mother had shaken with tears, trying to cope with the loss. He saw her lose all hope for justice. That moment was pivotal. Michael realized that if he didn't change something in this system, the story would repeat itself over and over. He swore to himself that he would become a doctor and fight for the truth, for those who, like Ricky, couldn't defend themselves. When the hospital call interrupted the silence, Michael knew this wasn't just another call. The nurse on the other end sounded tense. "Dr. Foster, we have an emergency," she said, her voice shaking with anxiety. "A young woman in critical condition. She was brought in from an accident. Please come as soon as you can." Michael immediately felt his blood boil with fear. He grabbed his keys and rushed out of the apartment. The drive to the hospital was familiar, but this time every meter seemed long and difficult. He thought about how every decision he made could be decisive, how tonight, like much of his life, would not be like any other. When he finally reached the hospital, Michael could already feel the tension in the air. He moved quickly through the hallways, but the whispers of his colleagues reached his ears before he could even step into the operating room. They had already begun discussing the incident with the police. His personal data, his reputation were already out in the open. It didn't take long for them to realize the trouble this situation could cause for him, especially in such a small town. This was about more than just his career. It was about his life, his every move being scrutinized. James, one of the senior surgeons, intercepted him as he entered the hospital. The tension between them was palpable. "Michael, we need to talk," James said, his voice quiet but heavy with concern. "You know what's happening. People are already talking, your personal information is already out there. This could ruin you." Michael stopped, feeling the anger start to rise inside him. This wasn't about the case at hand. This was about something deeper, something more dangerous. "I understand," Michael said, his voice low but firm. "But right now, I have someone to save. I'm not going to let this stop me." James hesitated but said nothing more. Michael brushed past him and made his way to the operating room. He could feel the weight of their stares on his back, but he knew he had no choice. He had to do this. He had to save this young woman. Every step he took, every decision he made, wasn't just for her. It was for everything he had fought for. His hands were steady as he scrubbed in, and his focus was sharp. This was not just about surgery. This was a fight. When he entered the operating room, everything else faded away. The only thing that mattered was the young woman on the table. Her life was hanging by a thread, and he had to be the one to save it. Each incision, each medication, each decision he made was a battle. A battle not only for her life but for something bigger, for the truth, for justice, for all those who had been left behind by a system that had failed them. As the surgery neared its end, Michael was beginning to stabilize her. But just then, the door to the operating room opened. Robert Crane, the police chief, stepped in. Michael's mind raced, but he maintained his composure. "How is she?" Crane asked, his voice sharp but tinged with worry. Michael didn't look at him, instead focusing on the final stages of the procedure. "She's still alive, but her condition remains critical," Michael said flatly, his words carrying more weight than he intended. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning of something much larger. He could feel the pressure mounting, the system closing in around him. But he wasn't going to back down. Michael removed his gloves, feeling the tension slowly leave his body. The surgery was over, and the patient was stabilized. Her life was no longer in immediate danger. Yet, relief didn't come. This was only a temporary victory. He knew that outside the operating room, another battle was waiting for him. The incident with the police, now public knowledge, had stirred up chaos. In this small town, where everyone knew everyone, Michael's reputation was now a subject of scrutiny, and the pressure was mounting. As he walked down the hospital corridors, Michael could feel the weight of the stairs on his back. Colleagues exchanged glances and hushed whispers as he passed by. Their curiosity and judgment were almost tangible. A nurse's gaze lingered on him a little too long before she quickly turned away. He knew what they were thinking. To them, he wasn't just the skilled surgeon they'd worked alongside for years. He was now the man who had been stopped by the police and whose name was making headlines. In a town like this, such a story could destroy everything he had built. The conversations weren't subtle. Michael caught fragments of words as he passed by groups of staff. Even those who had once supported him now seemed hesitant, their loyalty shaken by the spreading rumors. He could see it in their eyes. They were starting to doubt him. It wasn't fair, but fairness had never been a part of his journey. He had always had to work harder, prove more, just to be seen as equal. Now, it felt like all of that effort could unravel because of one incident. His thoughts were interrupted when he saw Robert Crane at the end of the corridor. The police chief walked with deliberate steps, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. Michael immediately felt the shift in the atmosphere. Crane wasn't there to check on the young woman's condition. He was there to tighten the noose. Michael knew this wasn't just about a conversation. It was about control. As Crane approached, Michael straightened his posture, refusing to let the man see any weakness. Their encounter wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. Crane represented everything Michael had fought against his entire life. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a confrontation with the system itself. Crane's words were measured and precise, each one carefully chosen to exert pressure. Michael listened, his face impassive, but inside, he felt the storm building. It was clear now, the police weren't going to let this go. They were preparing to make him the scapegoat, the example, for anyone who dared to challenge their authority. When Crane finally left, the air felt heavier. Michael returned to his office, hoping for a moment of clarity. But instead of solace, he found something that shook him to his core. His phone buzzed with a notification. A video. He opened it and his breath caught. It was a recording of his arrest. At first, it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary, but then he heard the voices. Familiar voices. "We need to cover this up," one of them said. "If we have to, we'll silence him. This incident can't get out." The words hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just an incident. It was a trap. A calculated effort to destroy him. They weren't content with stopping him. They wanted to erase him, to make him a cautionary tale. Michael's hands clenched into fists as the weight of the revelation sank in. This video was his chance to fight back. It was proof that could change everything. But it also put a target on his back. He knew the system he was up against wouldn't stop until it crushed him completely. He had to decide what to do next, and he had to decide quickly. The stakes had never been higher, and Michael knew this fight wasn't just about his reputation anymore. It was about survival. The hum of local news filled every corner of the small town like a heavy fog, obscuring truth under the weight of sensationalism. At home, Michael turned on the television and heard reporters dissecting the video of his arrest, framing it with headlines about injustice and public outrage. The anchor's tone was neutral, but the context was clear. He had become the central figure of a scandal, and now every move he made would be scrutinized. Alone in the room, with only the sound of the broadcast for company, Michael felt isolation press down on his chest. He knew the video leak had sparked a wave of conversations. That was inevitable. But he hadn't anticipated how deeply the fight for truth would cut into his personal life. He had always believed that his family was his anchor, his support system. But soon, the cracks in that foundation began to show. A message from his sister, Abby, who worked with the local police, popped up on his phone. The text was brief: "We need to talk." Michael's hands grew clammy as he considered calling her, but something told him this conversation needed to happen face to face. What he discovered left him stunned. What he thought was support turned out to be betrayal. Abby, Michael's younger sister, had always been his ally. She often told him how proud she was of his accomplishments and how inspired she was by his resilience. But when they met at a small cafe, her gaze lacked the warmth he was used to. Michael immediately sensed that something had shifted. They sat at a table, but silence lingered, heavy and suffocating. When Abby finally spoke, her voice was as cold as the early morning fog. "Michael, you need to stop," she said, avoiding his eyes. "What you're doing could destroy you. It's not worth it." Her words cut deeper than any insult. Michael felt his breath hitch as his muscles tensed. He remained silent for a moment, struggling to process her words. But his instincts screamed one thing: betrayal. She continued, explaining that Crane was just doing his job and that his actions were necessary to maintain order in the town. Michael heard her, but he couldn't believe it. Abby was defending the very system that had torn their family apart, the same system that had killed their brother. This betrayal was more devastating than any injustice Michael had faced before. After the conversation, Michael left in a daze. His family, the one pillar of support he thought he could rely on, had turned against him. Abby had chosen loyalty to the system over loyalty to her brother. For Michael, this wasn't just a personal blow. It was a test of his resilience, his morals. Back at home, he tried to gather his thoughts, but his unease only grew. On the table sat his phone, now both a weapon and a source of danger. The video exposing the police had become his shield. But as Michael soon learned, the police weren't going to let it go unanswered. The following day, Michael discovered that a secret investigation had been launched against him. Allegations of inciting violence, provoking public disorder, and even threats against law enforcement were being leveled at him. An anonymous source sent him the information, and Michael realized that the system was coming at him with full force. They were searching for any way to destroy his reputation and paint him as the villain. Each accusation felt like a blow to his resolve. Michael understood that backing down now would only validate the charges against him. But continuing to fight meant bracing for even greater losses. The weight of this responsibility crushed his chest, but he knew there was no other path. This battle was no longer just about justice. It was about moral values, about everything he believed was right. The crowd filled the town square, their voices and energy palpable as they gathered in anticipation. People stood shoulder to shoulder, faces marked by determination and hope. Michael stood on an improvised stage, towering over the masses, his heart pounding so loudly he could feel it in his temples. Today was the culmination of everything he had worked toward. The video exposing the police's corruption had gone viral, and he knew this was his moment to bring the system to light. Every word he planned to say was carefully chosen, each phrase sharpened into a weapon. He understood he wasn't just fighting a corrupt system, he was also confronting a community conditioned to silence. These people wanted change but didn't know how to achieve it. Michael intended to be their voice, but he also knew that one misstep could turn the tide against him. His voice cut through the air, steady and strong despite the storm of emotions inside. He spoke about justice, about how the system oppresses those who don't fit its mold. He shared stories of how race becomes an obstacle, how injustice seeps into every corner of society. The crowd responded, their cheers and applause punctuating his words. But everything shifted when he spotted a familiar face in the front row. Abby. His sister stood among the crowd, her expression cold and unreadable. Her presence felt out of place. Michael hesitated for a fraction of a second but pressed on, unwilling to let her distract him. Yet her gaze burned into him, a reminder of the growing rift between them. As the crowd continued to cheer, the atmosphere began to change. Michael felt a subtle tension ripple through the people, and soon it became clear why. Abby raised her hand, signaling for attention, and then spoke words that cut through the air like a blade. "This man is manipulating you," her amplified voice echoed over the square. "He's using your emotions to further his own ambitions. This is nothing more than a performance." A chill ran down Michael's spine. Her words were a dagger to the heart, a betrayal he hadn't anticipated. The crowd buzzed with murmurs, some exchanging confused glances, while others openly voiced their skepticism. This was more than a blow to his reputation. It was an attempt to dismantle everything he had fought for. Abby didn't stop there. She addressed the crowd, accusing Michael of exploiting their emotions and using their shared grief for personal gain. She dredged up old cases involving Michael, twisting their context to paint him as self-serving and disingenuous. Michael stood frozen for a moment, his mind reeling. This wasn't just public humiliation, it was an orchestrated effort to destroy him. But Michael wasn't ready to give up. He stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with pain. "The system I'm trying to expose is revealing its true face," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "When they run out of arguments, they attack those closest to you. They're not just trying to destroy me, they're trying to destroy the idea of justice itself." The crowd fell silent, their attention fully on him once again. Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. He explained that the video wasn't just evidence of corruption. It was a reminder of how far the system would go to silence dissent. He spoke of his brother, of the countless others who had suffered but whose voices were never heard. Abby stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the stage. Michael saw a flicker of doubt in her expression, as if part of her realized she had made a mistake. But it was too late to undo the damage. When Michael finished his speech, the applause was thunderous, yet inside he felt the weight of the battle he had just fought. He knew this was only the first skirmish in a long war. The system wouldn't back down, and betrayals would likely come again. But he also knew one thing. Even if he had to sacrifice everything, he would fight until the end. The city center no longer felt safe. The buzz of conversations, the grating sounds of cars crossing the main streets, and the fleeting shadows in alleyways reminded Michael how deeply the system he was fighting against had rooted itself. The tension after the rally had only grown worse. Hostile stares, rumors, and even anonymous threats became part of his daily life. But stopping wasn't an option. Each passing moment brought not just challenges but opportunities. Today's meeting promised to be one of those moments. In the backyard of an abandoned building surrounded by barbed wire, Michael waited for the man he had arranged to meet. A sense of danger lingered, but he couldn't let fear hold him back. His old acquaintance, David, a former police officer, emerged from the shadows. His face reflected a mix of tension and unease. "Michael," David said as he approached, his voice sharp yet weary, as if this decision had taken everything from him. Michael didn't respond immediately. He studied David carefully, trying to gauge whether he could trust him. Their paths had diverged long ago, but fate had brought them together again. David had been part of the very system Michael was fighting against. Yet today he offered help. David reached into his pocket, pulling out a flash drive, and handed it to Michael. "This has everything. Documents, audio files, evidence of how the police manipulate the narrative," David said. Michael took the flash drive but didn't pocket it. He couldn't accept it without questioning. "Why are you doing this?" Michael finally asked. David hesitated, averting his gaze. His face betrayed a mixture of guilt and fear. "Because I was part of it," he admitted. "I made a mistake, Michael. I saw how the system destroys people, and I couldn't stay silent anymore." Michael listened intently, but doubts clouded his mind. He knew accepting this help meant taking on immense risk. But the choice was clear: either he used this to continue fighting, or he surrendered, allowing the system to keep burying the truth. After their conversation, Michael left the meeting feeling a heavy weight in his chest. The flash drive in his pocket felt like both salvation and danger. He understood it could be his most powerful weapon, but exposing its contents might endanger not just himself but others as well. Hours later, Michael gathered his team, the group that had been assisting him in exposing the truth. They decided that the information would be released as soon as possible. But their plans began to unravel when the flash drive suddenly stopped working. Instead of revealing critical evidence, the screen displayed an encrypted file with an unknown code. A cold dread ran down Michael's spine. It was a trap. Everything he had believed to be a victory was a carefully orchestrated deception. The room was thick with tension. His team scrambled to figure out what had happened, but Michael already knew David wasn't who he claimed to be. Everything he had provided was part of a larger plan by the police. Suddenly, the room's door burst open, and several uniformed officers stormed in. Michael barely had time to react before they surrounded him. One of the officers loudly read out charges, declaring that Michael was accused of spreading false information and inciting public unrest. This was the end of his freedom. Michael realized that the system wasn't just trying to stop him, it was determined to obliterate him, to make an example of him for anyone else who might dare to resist. Yet even in this moment he refused to break. Determination burned in his eyes. He knew the fight wasn't over, even if it had to continue from behind bars. Michael sat in an empty room, with nothing but a small table, a chair, and a window covered in dirty glass. Light filtered through the cracks, casting faint patterns on the walls. The room had become his temporary shelter, but it didn't feel safe. Silence didn't exist here, only the echo of his own thoughts growing louder with each passing moment. In the span of days, he had lost everything. His family had distanced themselves, his friends had vanished as if they never existed. The hospital had suspended his duties under the guise of an investigation, which felt like the final blow. Michael was now alone, pitted against a world that seemed determined to destroy him. He knew the system had fully deployed its mechanisms. Wherever he went, he felt their eyes on him. Even here, in this small room, he sensed their presence. His phone was likely tapped, his emails probably hacked. Trust was a luxury he could no longer afford, and the crushing weight of solitude bore down on him harder than ever before. The pressure mounted. The police had spread stories accusing Michael of fabricating evidence, manipulating facts, and exploiting other people's tragedies for his personal gain. Every time he opened social media or checked the news, his name was surrounded by lies. His once sterling reputation as a surgeon who had saved countless lives was now reduced to a caricature of an attention seeker. Michael tried to distract himself, but his thoughts returned to the beginning. The image of his brother's death played over and over in his mind. The system had destroyed his family years ago, but only now did Michael fully grasp the depth of that tragedy. Back then, he was young and naive, believing in justice and the rule of law. But his brother's death had marked a turning point. It wasn't just a loss, it became his cross to bear. Every step he had taken since was a step toward this fight. Sitting at the table, he stared out the window, where dust clung to the glass. That layer of grime reminded him of how opaque everything around him had become. No matter how hard he tried to clear the truth, he was met with another stain, blocking his view. All he could see now was a vicious cycle, an endless loop with no way out. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His heart froze for a moment, then began to pound faster. Michael stood, his body tense, bracing for the worst. But it was only his neighbor, bringing him a small plate of food. It was a humble act, yet it carried more weight than she could have imagined. Her gesture was a quiet reminder that not everyone had turned against him. When she left, Michael sat back down. The food remained untouched. He had lost his appetite but couldn't shake the gratitude he felt. That small act of kindness reminded him that his fight still mattered. People like his neighbor couldn't stand against the system, but they supported him in silence. And that gave him strength. He began to wonder if continuing was worth it. Each day, his chances of success seemed slimmer. He knew that pressing forward would mean losing even the little he had left. But giving up would mean betraying his brother's memory, betraying the countless others who had suffered under the same system. Michael rose from his chair and walked to the window. The dust still coated the glass, but now he didn't see it as dirt. Instead, he noticed the light breaking through. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. It was hope. It still existed, even if it felt almost imperceptible. His decision was made. Michael knew he would lose more, perhaps even his life. But stopping was no longer an option. This was his fight, his cross to bear. He couldn't retreat into the shadows, even if the system crushed him completely. Because this battle was bigger than himself. It was for those who couldn't speak, for those who had already lost everything. Michael stood in the shadows of an old warehouse, hidden from the eyes of the city, feeling the growing tension tighten his chest. In his hands, he held a laptop, its screen glowing with the files that could change everything. This information had come to him through an unlikely ally, someone he never expected to meet again. Eric, a senior police officer, had re-entered Michael's life so suddenly it felt like a shot in the dark. They had once been classmates in university, but their paths had diverged. Eric chose a career in law enforcement, while Michael pursued medicine. Back then, Eric had been the kind of person who stayed on the sidelines when moral questions arose. But now, his choices had led him to disillusionment with the system he once served. Meeting Michael, Eric looked exhausted and defeated, yet determined. "This is my redemption," he said, handing Michael a flash drive containing critical evidence. "I want the world to know the truth." Now, they stood together, ready to take the final step. The evidence included financial records, conversation transcripts, and detailed plans exposing the system's corruption. Michael understood that they held the key to change, but it could also become the nail in his own coffin. They decided to send the materials to a trusted independent newspaper that could guarantee their publication. Precision and coordination were essential. Eric offered to leverage his network to avoid direct police interference. Michael, in turn, prepared a statement to accompany the evidence. Every step was calculated with care. When they arrived at the meeting spot, only minutes remained until the scheduled handoff. Michael sat in the car, watching Eric prepare to deliver the flash drive to a courier. The surroundings were quiet, but the silence felt deceptive. Michael's instincts screamed that something was wrong. Eric stepped forward, but before he could hand over the drive, everything changed. Armed officers emerged from a nearby building, shouting commands as they surrounded them. "Drop everything and put your hands up," a commanding voice rang out. Michael froze, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He glanced at Eric, who looked like he had known this moment was inevitable. It was a trap. Their entire operation had been compromised, and now they were caught in its web. As the officers closed in, one of them snatched the flash drive from Eric's hand. Michael could do nothing but watch as their one chance at the truth slipped away before his eyes. Everything he had fought for seemed to crumble in an instant. Both men were detained, but even in handcuffs, Michael couldn't suppress his rage. His mind raced with questions. How? Who betrayed them? Was it Eric? Or was the system even more omnipresent than he had imagined? In the holding cell, Michael sat with his back against the wall. His breathing was heavy, and his thoughts swirled in fragments. This was more than just a loss. It was the feeling that he had let down everyone who believed in him. But despite the despair, a new determination began to take root inside him. He knew the system couldn't destroy everything. Even if the files were gone, the truth still existed. It lived in the words, in the eyes of those who supported him at the rally. It lived in the courage of those who dared to speak out against injustice. And most importantly, it lived within him. Michael stood up, straightening his back as if piecing together all his inner strength. He didn't know how this fight would end, but he wasn't about to stop. Even if it cost him everything, he would continue. Because the truth always finds a way. Michael knew the system couldn't destroy everything. Even if the files were gone, the truth still existed. Michael sat on the cold, damp bench of his cell, the faint sound of dripping water echoing in the confined space. The walls around him seemed to press closer, heavy with the weight of defeat. His eyes were fixed on a crack in the peeling paint, a silent reminder of everything that had fallen apart. The flash drive with the evidence was gone, his reputation was in shambles, and those he trusted had turned away. He felt as though he had reached the bottom. Each day blurred into the next, filled with silence broken only by the distant thud of guards' boots on the concrete floor. Michael tried to push thoughts of failure from his mind, but they lingered. The system he fought against appeared insurmountable. It had taken everything from him. His family, his career, his hope. Memories of the rally resurfaced, vivid yet distant. The faces of the crowd, their cheers and belief in him, felt like echoes from another life. Back then, he had felt strong, convinced he could make a difference. Now, that conviction had faded. The cost of his fight had proven far greater than he ever anticipated. The sharp creak of the cell door pulled him from his thoughts. A man stepped inside, someone Michael recognized from the rally. He had seen him only once, standing silently at the edge of the crowd. The man looked tired, but his movements carried purpose. In his hands was a folder, its presence immediately commanding Michael's attention. Without a word, the man placed the folder on the table and left. Michael stared at the papers, hesitant to believe what he was seeing. Slowly, he reached for them, as if afraid they might disappear the moment he touched them. But the documents were real. Each page detailed the corruption he had fought to expose. Financial records, transcripts, undeniable proof of the system's rot. Hours passed as Michael pored over the evidence. It was as though a flicker of light had pierced the darkness surrounding him. The weight of loss lifted slightly as he realized that these documents, though they couldn't save him, might still save others. His thoughts turned to his brother, whose death had ignited this fight, and to those who had suffered in silence under the same system. They deserved justice. News of the corruption spread like wildfire. Independent media outlets published the evidence, and stories of the police's systemic abuse dominated the headlines. The once quiet town buzzed with conversations about change. People who had been afraid to speak now found their voices, demanding accountability. Michael saw it all on the small television mounted in the corner of his cell. The headlines, the reports, and the rising tide of public outrage filled him with a bittersweet sense of accomplishment. He knew he would never return to his old life. His family and friends were gone, his career destroyed. But none of that mattered anymore. The truth had finally come to light. When the guard informed him he was being transferred, Michael stood with a sense of ease he hadn't felt in years. He had nothing left to lose. He knew the price he had paid was steep, but it had been worth it. Staring out the small window of his cell, he noticed a faint beam of light breaking through the gray sky. Victory always comes at a cost, but for the truth, those sacrifices had been necessary. The hospital corridors greeted Michael with the sound of footsteps echoing against sterile walls. This was a place where he had always felt part of something greater. But now, this world seemed different. Each step carried memories of his fight, his losses, and the sacrifices he had made. His life would never return to what it once was. Colleagues' eyes followed him like shadows. Some looked at him with admiration, others with caution, but no one dared to speak first. He noticed a nurse lower her gaze as she passed by, while another doctor gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement. Everyone understood that he had endured what might have broken others. On one of the floors, he saw a woman sitting in the hallway, waiting. Her face was tense, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. Michael recognized that look. It was a blend of fear and hope, painfully familiar. When she glanced up, their eyes met. She seemed as though she wanted to say something but instead simply nodded in gratitude. That small gesture reminded Michael of why he continued to fight. Back in his office, the sense of closure still eluded him. Papers lay scattered across his desk, reports, requests, medical histories. All of it was part of his old life, yet now it felt foreign. He picked up a photograph of his brother that rested in the corner of the desk. Memories of their dreams for a better future surfaced, bittersweet and haunting. Outside the window, light began to break through the thick clouds. Michael gazed at the street below, where people hurried about their lives as if nothing had happened. For them, life went on. But for Michael, it was just beginning. His struggle was not an ending but the start of a new path. The fight had taught him that change doesn't happen overnight. The system that had stood unshaken for so long had started to crack, but dismantling it would take time. He saw it in the eyes of those who now dared to ask questions, in their voices that grew louder with each passing day. This was the purpose for which he had sacrificed everything. As he stepped out of his office, a young man in uniform stood nervously in the hallway. His gaze shifted uneasily until he noticed Michael. With a deep breath, he approached. "Doctor, I just wanted to say, thank you," the man mumbled before quickly walking away, not waiting for a response. That brief moment left a warmth in Michael's chest. He knew his work was only beginning. Change was a long journey requiring patience, faith, and sacrifice. But now he understood that, despite everything he had lost, his life had found meaning. At the hospital entrance, he paused to take in the cool air. The distant sounds of the city buzzed as a reminder that the world kept spinning. Yet, deep within, Michael felt that his efforts had not been in vain. People were beginning to listen. And that was the beginning.